At the very end of Rosewood Street, past the bend where the sidewalk cracks just enough for wild daisies to grow, and where the mailboxes lean like old men telling secrets, there stood a quiet little house. It wasn't remarkable. No white picket fence, no painted shutters, just a modest home with ivy along the windows, a squeaky gate that never quite latched, and a front porch where the same wind chime had sung the same 5 notes for over 20 years. The house belonged to Margaret. She was, by most accounts, a woman of few demands. She liked her mornings slow and her tea hot. She wore wool cardigans year-round, kept her nails neatly trimmed, and never left dishes in the sink overnight. Her life was quiet, not out of sadness, but out of rhythm. A rhythm she had grown into, like an old chair that eventually knows your weight. Margaret had lived alone in that house for 2 full decades. The last person to live there with her, her husband, Thomas, had passed quietly in his sleep on a rainy Tuesday morning. He had always said he preferred rain to sun. Rain makes people gentler, he'd once told her. They move slower. They notice the sound of their own thoughts. After Thomas died, Margaret never left Rosewood Street. She didn't need to. She had the garden he once planted with her, still blooming in unruly joy. She had the kettle they'd bought on their first anniversary, still whistling every morning like it knew her name. She had memories etched into the walls, the shadow of his favorite chair on the living room rug, the faint scrape on the floor from when he used to dance her around the kitchen without music. Margaret's days were stitched together by small rituals. She brewed 2 cups of tea every morning, one for herself, one for no one. She watered the same hydrangeas at 8 a.m. She fed the birds at 3:30 sharp. And each night before bed, she turned on the porch light, not because she expected anyone, but because Thomas had always said, no home should go dark if someone might be looking for it. Some days, she'd forget to eat lunch. Other days, she'd read the same page of her novel twice. But she was never lonely. Or at least, she didn't call it that. There was a difference, she believed, between being alone and being forgotten. Margaret wasn't forgotten. She just hadn't been interrupted in a long time. And yet, on a certain morning in early spring, when the wind was soft and the clouds held the kind of gray that hinted of rain, something would interrupt her. Something simple, something small, a knock on the door. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to remind the house that it still mattered. Just enough to remind Margaret that perhaps her quiet rhythm was about to change. Margaret's mornings were stitched together with rituals so familiar, they felt like second skin. Every morning, without exception, she rose at 6:45 a.m., just before the sun pushed through the lace curtains of her east-facing window. She took 3 slow steps toward the kettle, flipped the switch, and whispered, "Morning, Tom," as though her words traveled through the wires and steam. Then came the cups. Always 2. She never questioned it anymore. One for her, always the floral china with the fading rose pattern, rin chipped ever so slightly at the lip. The other, plain white, sturdy, heavy in the hand. Thomas's favorite. She always placed it opposite her at the table, directly across from her seat, perfectly aligned. She poured equal amounts of tea into both. 2 teaspoons of sugar in hers, just 1 in his. A drop of milk, stirred clockwise, never counter. Even after all these years, she remembered. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't denial. It was memory preserved in motion. She used to think grief would be loud, full of sobbing and wailing and arms thrown skyward in despair. But hers had been silent. It crept in like winter mist, making everything soft slower. Until silence became her closest companion. Sometimes she spoke into it. "You wouldn't believe how tall the Andersons' boy is now," she'd say aloud. "You said he'd never grow past 5 feet, but he's a head taller than me." Or, "I saw that old Dodge of yours parked at Miller's garage. Someone's trying to fix it up. Took them long enough to see what you saw in it." She'd pause, as if waiting for a reply. Of course, none ever came. But that never stopped her from talking. The house had grown used to the sound of her voice weaving in and out of silence. It had become a kind of music, not with notes, but with intention. And though only 1 set of footsteps echoed across the floor each morning, 2 chairs were always pulled out, 2 napkins folded, 2 spoons resting on saucers. On particularly quiet mornings, she would sit for a long time, both hands wrapped around her cup, eyes drifting toward the second, untouched, yet never unloved. It was more than a ritual. It was a declaration. You are here. You are still with me. The town knew her as the widow at the end of Rosewood. Some thought it sad, even odd, that she clung to such routines. But Margaret never saw it that way. She saw it as keeping her promise. To remember. To live well. To leave space for love, even if it had no physical form left. Some days, she would reach across the table and rest her fingers gently against the rim of his cup, as if to anchor herself. And in those quiet touches, there was more intimacy than words ever carried. One afternoon, a curious neighbor child, maybe 6 or 7, once asked her, "Why do you make 2 cups if you're the only one here?" Margaret had smiled softly, crouched down, and replied, "Because love doesn't end when someone leaves. Sometimes it just needs a place to sit." The child had blinked, then nodded solemnly, as if understanding some grown-up secret she would one day remember. That morning, the one with the knock had begun no differently. The kettle had whistled. The tea had steeped. 2 cups had been filled. Margaret had turned toward the table, humming a song neither she nor Thomas ever remembered the name of. It was just one of those tunes that stayed, like certain faces and smells from childhood. And then, knock knock. A soft, uncertain tapping, like a question with no punctuation. She paused, teacup in hand. The knock came again. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the jarring unfamiliarity of interruption. In this house, time rarely knocked. She placed both cups on the table, careful not to spill. One in front of her seat, one across. The steam curled above both, briefly intertwining before drifting into their own air. Then she turned, pulled her shawl a little tighter around her shoulders, and walked slowly to the door. When she opened it, the world outside smelled of spring rain and damp pavement. And standing there, rain-kissed, uncertain, holding a worn envelope like it was something sacred, was a young woman Margaret had never seen before. The girl couldn't have been more than 25. She stood beneath the porch overhang, a worn denim jacket pulled tight around her, her hair damp from the drizzle, with strands clinging to her cheeks like ivy to brick. In her hands, slightly crumpled but clearly protected, was an envelope, yellowed at the edges. The kind with thick paper you don't see much anymore. "I think this was delivered to your address by mistake," the girl said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. Margaret blinked once, adjusting her eyes to the light beyond the doorway. She looked at the envelope, then at the girl, and back again. Her fingers, slow but steady, reached out. The girl handed her the letter as if it might shatter. Margaret turned it over. The handwriting was unmistakable. She hadn't seen it in more than 2 decades, but she would have known it anywhere. The slight tilt to the left. The neat loops in the G's. The way the capital T was shaped like a miniature tree. It was Thomas's handwriting. But that was impossible. Her breath caught, not with panic, but with something quieter. A tremor beneath the ribs. The kind of feeling you get when a song you haven't heard in 30 years begins to play on the radio and, for a moment, you are young again. She turned the envelope toward the light. To Thomas E. Whitmore, Rosewood Street, number 147. No return address. Her old address, but not quite correct. Number 147 was theirs, is hers. But the letter had been addressed to him, not her. And the postmark, she squinted. Smudged. But the date read 2001. 24 years ago. She didn't speak right away. Her eyes lingered on the writing, fingers tracing the edge. The girl stood patiently, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "I'm sorry," the girl said gently. "I didn't open it, I swear. I was walking past and found it in my mailbox. I just moved in across the street, number 144. I thought maybe someone here would know who it belonged to." Margaret finally looked up. Her voice, when it came, was soft, measured. "He's been gone a long time." The girl opened her mouth, then hesitated. "I'm sorry." Margaret shook her head. "Don't be. I just didn't expect to see his handwriting again. Not today." She gestured to the porch chair. "You must be cold. Do you want to come in for a moment?" Out of the rain. The girl hesitated, just long enough for politeness, and then nodded. Inside, the house was warm with the smell of chamomile and something softer, a scent of paper, of years. The girl took in the space quietly. 2 teacups steamed on the table. "You were expecting someone?" she asked gently, noticing the setup. Margaret smiled faintly. "Just to have it." The girl nodded, understanding more than she let on. They sat across from one another. Margaret held the letter in her lap, unopened. She wasn't ready, not yet. Its weight felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. "Do you know who might have sent it?" the girl asked after a moment. "No," Margaret whispered. "But Thomas. He wasn't the kind of man to leave loose ends." The girl Eliza, she would later learn, glanced around the room. Her eyes landed on the photos along the mantel, black and white snapshots slightly faded. A man with kind eyes and a crooked smile. A woman in her youth, laughing. A picnic blanket. A hand-carved wooden frame. "You've lived here a long time," Eliza said, more observation than question. Margaret nodded. 42 years. 22 of them alone. "And still making tea for 2, Eliza murmured. The comment wasn't judgmental. In fact, it held something like reverence. Margaret studied the girl across from her. There was something familiar about her, not in face, but in presence. Like the way she cupped her hands around the warm tea Margaret had placed before her. The way her eyes softened when she looked at the second cup. They sipped quietly for a few minutes. Outside, the rain turned steady. Not stormy, just a peaceful patter against the window panes, like fingers tapping out forgotten lullabies. The envelope still rested in Margaret's lap, unopened. "I don't know why," she said at last, voice barely above a whisper, "but something in me says I shouldn't open this alone." Eliza looked up. "I can stay," she said. Margaret nodded. And just like that, a ritual interrupted became a memory shared. A knock on the door became an invitation. And a letter from the past found its way into the hands of the only person who would understand its weight. Not because of what it said, but because of what it stirred. Margaret wasn't sure how long they sat like that, 2 women, one older and one younger, separated by decades, but somehow joined by the quiet hum of a rainy afternoon. The tea cooled slowly between them. Neither reached for the letter. Not yet. Instead, they talked. At first, it was light. The way strangers often begin. Eliza shared that she had just moved into the neighborhood 3 weeks ago, renting the little brick house across the street, the one with ivy growing wild over the mailbox. She was between jobs, between cities, between parts of her life, she said with a small laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I needed quiet," she added after a pause. "And this street, well, it felt like it remembered things. Like it wouldn't rush me." Margaret smiled knowingly. "That's Rosewood," she said. "Even the trees don't seem in a hurry." Eliza chuckled. She noticed the gentle rhythm of the house, how every shelf, every picture frame, seemed to have been placed with care. She saw the ceramic birds on the windowsill, the radio in the corner that looked like it had played 1,000 Sunday jazz songs, and the soft cardigan Margaret wore, the kind knitted by hands that knew patience. "This house feels lived in," Eliza said softly. "It has been," Margaret nodded. By joy, by loss, and everything in between. They fell into a quiet silence, the kind that isn't uncomfortable, the kind that suggests 2 people are content just being. Rain tapped gently against the glass, and the scent of chamomile and old wood lingered in the air. Then Eliza looked back at the envelope resting on the table between them. "Do you ever think about the way the universe lines things up?" she asked. "Like, how a letter written decades ago can just now show up in someone else's mailbox? What are the chances?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the second cup, the one she always poured but never touched, and gently placed it in front of Eliza. "Maybe it was meant to come to the right person," she said quietly. "Even if that person isn't the one it was addressed to." Eliza stared at the cup, then looked back at Margaret. "I didn't know people still remembered this way," she said. "My generation, we throw things out. We replace. We move on." Margaret smiled, eyes soft. "I don't blame you. Sometimes starting over feels like the only way to survive. But some of us, we choose to stay. To sit with memory. To steep in it like tea. It takes longer, but the flavor is stronger. Eliza let those words settle. Then she glanced around the room once more. Did you and Thomas have children? She asked gently. Margaret shook her head, but without sadness. We tried. Life had other plans. She didn't elaborate and Eliza didn't press. But in the way Margaret held her teacup, in the way her eyes softened at the name Thomas, the rest was understood. I think he would have liked you, Margaret said suddenly, surprising even herself. Eliza blinked. You think so? You ask the right questions. You listen before you speak. And you care about things other people overlook, like misdelivered letters and old women drinking tea alone. Eliza smiled, this time with warmth. I don't think you're alone, she said. Not really. Margaret looked at her, eyes brimming with something not quite tears, more like recognition. You might be right, she whispered. Another pause. Another breath. Then Eliza said the words that shifted everything. Would it be all right if I came back again? Maybe tomorrow? We could read the letter together. If you'd like. Margaret looked at her, really looked, and in that moment, it was not Eliza's face she saw, but the face of 1,000 mornings she thought had ended. The one across the table. The one who had left, yet lingered in every gesture she repeated. Yes, Margaret said. I'd like that very much. Eliza rose, offered to help clear the cups, and promised she'd return at the same time the next day. As the door closed softly behind her, Margaret stood in the quiet once more. But this time it didn't feel quite the same. The second cup wasn't untouched anymore. The silence wasn't as still. And on the table, the envelope waited, not as a burden, but as a bridge. Outside, the rain softened. And for the first time in years, Margaret left the porch light on, not out of habit, but in anticipation. Someone might actually be coming back. The following morning, Margaret awoke before the alarm clock buzzed. Not that she ever needed it. Her body had long since tuned itself to the rhythm of sunrise. But this morning felt different. There was an unfamiliar sense of anticipation in the stillness. Not anxiety, not restlessness, just possibility. She moved through her morning routine more carefully than usual, not rushed, but aware, as though each gesture now carried new meaning. She brushed her silver hair back and tied it in a soft bun, the way she used to when company came. She added an extra spoon of honey to the tea. She changed into her olive cardigan, the one with embroidered leaves around the cuffs, a gift from Thomas, decades ago. And then, almost instinctively, she reached for the radio. It was old, an AM/FM set from the 1970s with a dial that clicked when turned, and speakers that hummed faintly even when silent. She hadn't turned it on in over a year. But today, something in her fingers guided her there. She clicked it on. Static first. Then a soft crackle. She turned the dial slowly, passing news and weather until she landed on something unexpected: music. Not modern. Not the kind that thumps and pulses. But something slower. Familiar. Ella Fitzgerald. Every time we say goodbye, I die a little. Margaret froze. It had been their song, hers and Thomas's. Played at their wedding. Again on their 10th anniversary. And once, tenderly, during a quiet moment in the kitchen when he'd pulled her close without warning, pressing his forehead to hers as the kettle whistled behind them. She closed her eyes. And for a moment, she could feel him. Not in some ghostly, dramatic way, but in the warmth that pooled in her chest. In the way her shoulders dropped. In the way the room seemed to hold its breath alongside her. She stood there, letting the music fill the space. And when the song ended, she didn't turn the radio off. Instead, she let it play soft jazz and slow ballads drifting through the house like dust caught in morning light. At 9:03 a.m., a knock came at the door. Not hurried. Not hesitant. Just enough to say, I'm here, like I promised. She opened the door, and there stood Eliza, holding a bag of scones, slightly out of breath from the walk up the street, and wearing a sweater 3 sizes too big for her. I wasn't sure if you'd really want me to come back, she said, offering a sheepish smile. I turned on the radio this morning, Margaret replied instead. First time in ages. Eliza blinked. What made you do that? I don't know, Margaret said, stepping aside. Maybe I wanted to hear something that remembered me. Eliza entered, her eyes quickly scanning the room the way people do when returning to a place they're starting to feel familiar with. "Smells like chamomile again," she said. "And cinnamon," Margaret added, lifting the lid on a small tin. "I thought the scones might like it." They sat at the table, same spots as the day before. The envelope lay where Margaret had left it, not moved, not touched, just waiting. "I almost opened it last night," she admitted, fingers brushing the corner of the letter. "But you didn't." "No. Something told me to wait. That it wasn't meant for just me anymore." Eliza nodded, and they sipped their tea in silence. The music from the radio played gently in the background, a piano piece, soft and unintrusive, like the soundtrack of a memory not yet formed. "Do you want to open it now?" Eliza finally asked. Margaret looked at the envelope. She didn't fear what was inside. What she feared was that it might close something, that reading it might be an ending rather than a beginning. "I think so," she whispered. "But not here. Not yet." Eliza tilted her head. "Where then?" Margaret looked toward the window, past the garden, past the old fence, toward the bench under the oak tree at the edge of the yard. "Out there," she said. "That's where he used to read letters to me. On sunny days." Eliza nodded slowly. "Let's take it outside," she said. So they wrapped themselves in scarves and shawls, picked up the envelope, 2 teacups, and a small woven blanket, and stepped into the soft light of the mid-morning sun. The ground was still damp from yesterday's rain, but the air smelled clean, like beginnings. Birds hopped between branches. The old oak tree stood tall, silent witness to decades of life. They sat on the bench, side by side, the envelope resting gently between them. And as the breeze brushed the edges of Margaret's hair, she smiled and said, "Maybe it's time." The bench beneath the oak tree had aged with grace. Its wood, once honey-colored, had grayed over the years, worn smooth by time, weather, and the backs of 2 people who once sat side by side there, rain or shine. Thomas had built it himself during the spring of '78, hammering each nail while Margaret brought him lemonade and shook her head at his stubbornness. "This tree's been here longer than the house," he'd said. "Might as well give it company." Now Margaret lowered herself gently onto the bench, Eliza beside her, both wrapped in a shawl that smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar chests. The envelope sat in her lap, quiet, weightless, yet charged with the electricity of memory. The breeze was light, not cold, just enough to carry whispers through the leaves. Margaret looked down at the letter. The handwriting hadn't changed. Still his. Still Thomas. But her hands trembled now, not from fear, but from reverence. "I used to read all his letters aloud," she said softly, "even when he sent them from just a few towns over. He always said that written words were only half alive until they were spoken." "Then let's bring this one to life," Eliza replied, just above a whisper. With that, Margaret gently opened the seal. The paper inside was slightly yellowed, but not brittle. Folded neatly, precisely, like Thomas had done with every shirt in their drawers, every napkin at dinner, every moment he tucked her hair behind her ear. She unfolded it slowly. Her eyes scanned the words, and for a long time, she didn't speak. Eliza waited. She watched as Margaret's expression shifted, not dramatically, not like the movies, but subtly. Her brows lifted, her lips parted, and her hand came to rest lightly on her chest. A breath caught. A tear welled, not out of sorrow, but out of recognition. Then Margaret began to read aloud. "My dearest Maggie, if this letter ever reaches you, it means time has done its thing, marched ahead without asking permission. I wrote this today, knowing I might never send it. But still, I wanted you to have it somehow." Margaret paused, her voice trembling. She looked at Eliza, who gave a small nod. "Keep going. There are things I never found the right day to say. Not because I didn't want to, but because life, in all its noise and urgency, made room for routine and left less for reverence. So if you're reading this, I want to say, thank you." A tear slid down Margaret's cheek. "Thank you for the 1,000 quiet mornings, for the way you looked at me like I was still the man who danced terribly in college. Thank you for the tea, always with honey, for knowing when to speak and when silence was enough." The letter continued, gentle and plain, no grand declarations, Just love folded into everyday things. Her humming in the garden, the way she laughed at his bad puns, the exact way she used to reach for his hand when crossing the street. Then came a final paragraph. Margaret's voice softened, barely above a breath. If one day you sit alone with 2 cups of tea, one full and untouched, know that I am not far. I am in the steam, in the chair across from you, in the place where your memory and my soul still sit down together. Don't be afraid to make new memories. And if someone knocks one day, let them in. They might be carrying a little bit of me with them. Margaret's hands trembled now, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. Eliza didn't speak. She just reached over and gently rested her hand atop Margaret's. I think he knew, Margaret whispered. Somehow he knew I'd still be here, waiting, pouring 2 cups. And he wanted you to know, Eliza replied, that you didn't have to sit alone forever. For a long while, they didn't move. The oak tree above them rustled gently, its branches creaking like old bones telling old stories. Sunlight filtered through in soft patches, landing on the page on Margaret's lap, on the bench that had waited all these years. Finally, Margaret folded the letter. She didn't cry. She didn't sob. But in the stillness of that morning, something shifted. It was like a sigh being released after holding your breath for 20 years. A loosening. A homecoming. She looked at Eliza and said, "Would you stay for lunch?" Eliza smiled. "I'd love to." And so, arm in arm, they stood and walked back toward the house, the letter safe in Margaret's pocket, the cups still waiting on the table, and the door left just slightly ajar, as if, now, it finally expected company. Lunch was modest, just the way Margaret liked it. A vegetable soup that had simmered all morning, slices of fresh bread, still warm from the oven, and a small dish of soft butter. The kind of meal made with quiet hands and a full heart. They ate by the kitchen window, the one overlooking the roses she'd tended for years. Eliza asked about each one, the climbing red one named Beatrice, the small white bloom called Pearl. Margaret spoke about them like old friends, recounting their histories, their stubborn seasons, the times they bloomed late and surprised her. "I don't think I've ever named a flower," Eliza said, smiling. "That's because you haven't loved one long enough," Margaret replied with a wink. After the dishes were cleared, Eliza lingered near the bookshelf in the hallway, tracing her fingers across old spines, everything from Virginia Woolf to gardening manuals from the 60s. She paused near a framed photograph, a much younger Margaret, standing beside Thomas on what looked like their anniversary. He had one arm around her, the other holding up a record sleeve, grinning like a boy. "You two looked solid," Eliza murmured. Margaret nodded from across the hall. "We were. Not perfect, but rooted." He was the kind of man who didn't just promise to come home, he always did. Then, near the bottom shelf, Eliza noticed something. A slim, leather-bound book with a ribbon tied around it, delicate, hand-stitched edges, dusty but well-kept. "What's this?" she asked, gently lifting it. Margaret turned. Her eyes lit with a trace of surprise. "That's the guest book. For the house." "No," Margaret said, walking over. "For the heart." Eliza looked puzzled. Margaret smiled and sat beside her, brushing her fingers over the cover. After Thomas passed, she began. People came, family, neighbors, friends from long ago. Some stayed a while, some only minutes. But every person who crossed that door left something. A story. A meal. A prayer. I kept the book not for visitors, but for the moments they gave me. Eliza opened the first page. Written in soft cursive. "To Margaret, who teaches us that grief is a rune, not a prison. Anna W., 2004. Further down. The lemon pie was perfect, even if the crust burned. Just like life. George H., 2006. And, your roses told me more about patience than any preacher ever did. Lillian, 2010. Eliza flipped through slowly. Every page held something small and sacred, like footprints through time. It wasn't just a book. It was proof that life had continued, even quietly, even painfully. Then she paused. Near the back, written in a much newer ink, in a handwriting that looked almost like her own. "To the woman who pours 2 cups of tea, thank you for letting me stay. Eliza blinked. But I didn't write this. Margaret leaned closer. I know, she said gently. I wrote it. Last night. Eliza looked at her. Margaret's voice was steady. I didn't know your name then. But I knew someone would come. That someone would knock. That one day it wouldn't be just me and the silence anymore. Eliza looked down at the page. Her throat tightened. It was you who left the letter in my mailbox, wasn't it? She said suddenly. Half a joke, half a wondering. Margaret laughed softly. No, dear. That much I promise. I've never been good at magic. But maybe, she added, the universe has been. They sat in silence for a moment, two women from different seasons of life, bound now by something more than coincidence. Then Eliza looked around, her eyes soft. May I? She asked, motioning to the guest book. Margaret nodded. Eliza took the pen that rested in the spine and turned to the next page. She wrote slowly, carefully. And when she was done, she passed it to Margaret, who read the words silently. To Margaret, who reminded me that we're never too old to open the door again. Eliza, 2025. Margaret smiled. Her hand closed gently over the book. Would you stay for supper too? She asked. Eliza didn't hesitate. I'd be honored. The kitchen filled once again with the scent of something warm. Margaret moved like she always had, methodically, unhurried, with a grace that came from years of doing things alone, and doing them well. But this evening felt different. Her hands didn't just cook, they remembered. And now they shared. Eliza offered to help, but Margaret waved her gently toward the kettle. You set the table. I'll handle the rest. So Eliza laid out two mismatched placemats, one floral, one plain, and lit a stubby candle that stood lopsided in a teacup. It was all beautifully imperfect. They sat down as the last light slipped behind the oak tree. Dinner was vegetable stew, buttered potatoes, and a salad made with things from the garden, herbs Margaret could name by smell alone. Between bites, they talked. About books. About places Eliza had never been but longed for. About memories Margaret hadn't shared in years, not because they hurt, but because there had simply been no one to hand them to. And then, without planning it, without a dramatic pause or shift in tone, Margaret spoke of the night Thomas died. He'd fallen asleep in that chair, she said, glancing over her shoulder. Just after dinner. There was a record playing, and the light was golden, like tonight. I went to the kitchen for just a minute. When I came back, he was gone. Just like that. Silence fell, but it wasn't heavy. Eliza looked over at the armchair by the fireplace, Thomas's chair. Still in its place. The fabric slightly worn, the cushion sunken just enough to remember a shape. I never moved it, Margaret continued. Couldn't. Not out of grief, really. But because it never felt truly empty. Some evenings, I'd pour 2 cups of tea. One for me, and one for the space where his warmth used to be. Eliza said nothing, just watched the way Margaret's eyes softened as they rested on the chair. But tonight, Margaret added quietly, I poured 2 cups, and placed both on the table. Eliza's gaze returned to her own cup, still warm in her hands. I noticed. Margaret smiled. That chair will always hold something of him. But I think it no longer needs to be the only place where love sits. They finished their meal slowly, as if they were afraid to break the spell. When the plates were cleared and the candle burned low, Eliza stood and walked to the armchair. She didn't sit. Instead, she placed her hand lightly on the backrest, just for a moment. I don't think he minds, she said. I don't think so either, Margaret replied. Then, almost shyly, Eliza looked back. May I come again tomorrow? Margaret didn't answer right away. She just walked over to the little bookshelf in the hallway, untied the ribbon on the guest book, and opened it to a fresh page. She handed Eliza the pen. No need to ask, she said. You're already part of the story. Eliza wrote her name. Just her first name. But somehow it felt whole. Like a thread quietly woven into the fabric of something long, quiet, and sacred. As she stepped out into the night, the porch light was already on. The wind carried the scent of rosemary and old roses. Somewhere inside, the radio had started again, playing something soft, something wordless, like a lullaby between generations. And for the first time in years, Margaret closed the door behind someone, not with a click of finality, but with a whisper that said, "You are welcome again." And in the chair by the fire, though no one sat in it, the room no longer felt lonely, just full.